Hello and welcome to Lesson 8 of the Basic Music Theory course. In this lesson I want to look at transposition. There are going to be two types that we're going to be looking at. The first is just transposing a melody up or down an octave into a different clef. So the four clefs we usually have in classical music are the treble clef, the bass clef, the alto clef and the tenor clef. Okay, so let's get started. Say I just want to move a melody, not transpose it, but just move it from one clef into another. Say I just want to write a melody that's in the treble clef, and I want to write that same melody into the bass clef. Well, the first thing to do is to find a note that's common in each clef, a note that you're comfortable with, that you know exactly where it is without having to think about it. The note that I use is middle C, and I know that middle C is located on the first ledger line beneath the treble clef. Okay, so that's my middle C in the treble clef, and it's also located as my first ledger line above the bass clef. So in fact, those two notes are the exact same. If I was to draw just one big note, middle C, that's where middle C is located on the treble clef, but it's also where middle C is located on the bass clef. So that's the note that I'm going to use, the unifying note or your common denominator, whatever you want to call it. That's the note that I use to determine how to move a melody from one clef into another. So let's have a go at moving a couple of notes from the treble clef into the bass clef. So the very first thing you do is find a note that's common in one clef and in another clef that you're comfortable with. A note that you know exactly where it is without thinking about it. Okay, and as I've already said, I use middle C. Okay, so that's middle C in the treble clef, and it's just a ledger line beneath the clef, and middle C in the bass clef is just a ledger line above. So now I need to look at that E. These are the two notes that I want to move into the bass clef. So let's have a look at that E and count how far away is that E from the C. Well, it's a third up from the C, a third up from the middle C in the treble clef. So if it's a third up from the middle C in the treble clef, it's also got to be a third up from the middle C in the bass clef, and that would place it there. So not only do those two notes sound exactly the same, those two notes will sound exactly the same. Okay, one is just written, the top one is written in the treble clef and the bottom one's written in the bass clef, but they're both E. Again, the same principles apply for every note that you just want to move from one clef into the other. Now we want to move this G into the bass clef, and that G is a fifth above middle C. So if it's a fifth above middle C in the treble clef, it's got to be a fifth above middle C in the bass clef. So that means that we're going to end up using even more ledger lines. Okay, so those two notes will sound exactly the same. And that's basically how we move notes from one clef into another. All you've got to do is find a note that's common. In this case I've used the middle C, and then count to see how far away is one note in one clef from that middle C, and it's got to be the exact same distance in the other clef. And then if you want to move other notes, again you just count how far away is the note from middle C in one clef, and it's got to be the exact same distance away from middle C in the other clef. So I hope you can see why we have a treble clef and a bass clef. Why do we have all these different clefs? They're basically there to help us write melodies without having to use loads and loads of ledger lines. Okay, so if you wanted to write loads of high notes, obviously you're going to use the treble clef and insert them in here. because if you don't, if you're going to put them in the bass clef, as you can see, you're going to end up using loads and loads of ledger lines. As you can see, the E has 2 ledger lines and the G has 3 ledger lines. So can you imagine a melody that has loads of high notes? If you're trying to write it in the bass clef, you'd end up having loads of ledger lines for one note followed by loads of ledger lines for another note, and so on and so on and so on. And that's very tiring and difficult for a musician to read. So to save the musician having to read all those ledger lines, and also to save you having to write them all out as a composer, you would actually put the high melody into the treble clef. Same thing goes for the low melody. You would obviously put them in the down here in the bass clef, because it means then that you don't have to put loads of ledger lines under the treble clef this time. So you wouldn't have to put loads of low notes in the treble clef that look like that, okay, followed by loads of other low notes that look like that. So rather than having loads of low notes in the treble clef, you put all the low notes into the bass clef, and then you can comfortably insert them in the 5 lines and 4 spaces that you're already given. Okay, so that's why we have different clefs basically. So this is the alto clef that we're using now instead of the bass clef. It's a little bit difficult for people to get used to at first, because unless you play certain orchestral instruments, you probably have never come across this clef before. The treble clef and the bass clef are the most popular, but there are other clefs that exist besides those two. So the alto clef is very different to the other clefs that we've looked at. In the treble clef, your middle C was here. In the bass clef, your middle C was also 1 ledger line, except it was above the clef. But in the alto clef, your middle C is actually located right in the middle. Okay, so that's easy enough to remember. Middle C is in the middle. It's basically where we have the 2 lines touching, where they intersect. Right in the middle is where your, right in here is where your middle C is located. Okay, so this middle C is exactly the same as that middle C, exactly the same note, except one is written in the treble clef and one is written in the alto clef. So if I wanted to write those 2 notes, that E and the G, but I wanted to write them in the alto clef, I use the exact same principle as before. If it's a third above middle C in one clef, it's got to be a third above middle C in the other clef. So that would place that E on that line, the second line from the top. So those 2 E's will sound exactly the same. Okay, one E is written in the treble clef and one E is written in the alto clef. Again, the same thing for the G. If the G is a fifth above middle C in one clef, it's got to be a fifth above middle C in the other clef, which would place that G there. So now those 2 notes will sound exactly the same. Okay. This is the tenor clef that we're using now. Again, it's actually quite similar to the alto clef that we just looked at, because instead of your middle C being here in the middle of the staff, it's now located on the second line from the top, and again it's just located where these 2 lines touch, okay, right in here. Okay, so that's where your middle C is located on the tenor clef. And again, it's exactly the same note. It's going to sound exactly the same as this middle C on the treble clef. So those 2 notes will sound the same. And again, we use the exact same principles as before. So if you want to write that E in the tenor clef this time, that E is still just a third above middle C. So that E would be located here on the tenor clef. So those 2 notes will sound the same. And again, the G, which is a fifth above middle C in the treble clef, has got to be a fifth above middle C in the tenor clef. So that G is actually located here, okay, because that is also a fifth. So the same principles apply for all clefs, no matter what clef you're using. If you're looking to move just the notes from one clef into another, just find a common note and then count how far away it is in one clef, and then it's got to be exact same distance in the other clef. So let's look now at transposing melodies, transposing notes, rather than just moving notes from one clef into another. I'm now going to transpose all of these notes down an octave into a new clef. So we're no longer just moving the notes from one clef to another, we're actually going to transpose the notes as we're moving them from one clef to another. So I want to transpose all those notes an octave lower into the bass clef. Okay, so I don't want to just move them, I want to transpose them an octave lower into the bass clef. So the very first thing we do is the same thing as before, find a point of reference, find a note that you're comfortable with in both clefs, and for me that was middle C, so I'm just going to draw a big middle C here, just to remind me that this is what middle C looks like beneath the treble clef. It's the first ledger line beneath the treble clef, and it's the first ledger line above the bass clef. So that's our common note between both clefs. So now we can look at that melody in the treble clef. The very first note is a B. Okay, it's the B above middle C. It's the B above that red note that we have drawn out there, that red middle C. So if that's the B above middle C, we want to move it down an octave, so we're going to have it the B beneath middle C. And given that we know that that middle C is the first ledger line above the bass, then the B note is going to be directly beneath it. Okay, so it's going to be that B. Okay, so those two notes are an octave apart. Okay, so the one in the bass clef is an octave beneath the one in the treble clef. From this point on, there are two different ways of transposing the rest of the melody. We can continue the way that we've just been doing it so far and just transpose each individual note and work out its relationship to middle C, or we can do it a second way, which I'm going to show you now. If we look at the first two notes in the treble clef, between that B and the A, it moves down a step. So if it moves down a step in the treble clef, it's got to move down a step in the bass clef. Okay, as you can see. So that's the other way of doing it, is just work out how far away each note is relative to each other. Let's do the next one. So the melody in the treble clef moves up from A to C. So the melody in the bass has to move up from A to C. It actually lands on our middle C. Okay, so that moves up. And then we can see that the next note in the treble clef is we move down a step. Okay, and we can do that with the bass as well. We move down a step here. Okay, sorry, it's a wee bit messy. And you continue on to do that for the rest of the melody. So, for example, we move down another step, down to an A. Then we move down two steps, down to an F. We move up one step, up to a G. Just drawing the values of those notes. Then we move up quite a big leap from G to E. So again, we have to move up from G to E. And then we move down a step from E to D. Okay, so you can do it that way. You can just follow the contours of the melody. If it moves down a step and then down a leap of a third, then up a second, and then up to E, and then down to D, the exact same movement has got to happen in the bass. Down to your B, down to your A, down to your F, up to your G, big leap up to E, and then down to D. Okay, so exactly the same movement in the melody. So let's see if we can move the same melody but now into the alto clef. And again, I've just drawn out where my middle C is in my treble clef in red. Okay, so that's the first ledger line beneath the treble clef. And I've also drawn out my middle C in the alto clef again in red, just as a point of reference. So let's do the same thing that we did before, except this time we're going to be using a different clef. So again, we're starting off with a B, but we want that B to go down an octave, be transposed down an octave. And if we stick to the treble clef just for a second, you can see that if we move that B, it's the B above middle C, and if we transpose it down, it's going to be the B beneath middle C. So it's going to be down here. Okay, so if that's the B beneath middle C, then that B has got to be beneath middle C in the alto clef. Okay, so remember where middle C is in the alto clef, it's that line right in the middle. So it's going to be this note, because it's going to be the note immediately beneath. So if it's immediately beneath middle C on this clef, then it's got to be the note immediately beneath middle C in this clef as well. So I've just continued out with the rest of the melody just to show you what it looks like in the alto clef. And again, it's going to follow the exact same contours as the treble clef. So you're starting off on that B, it moves down a note, so it's got to move down a note in the alto clef, moves up to C, moves up to C, moves down to B, moves down to B, moves down to A, moves down to A, leaps down to an F, leaps down to an F, moves up to G, moves up to G, big leap up to E, big leap up to E, moves down to D, moves down to D. So again, the melody should follow the exact same outline as before. Okay, so always check that, always go over that when you're transposing, just to make sure that you haven't made any slip-ups. It's very easy to do. And last but by no means least, we're going to transpose this melody into the tenor clef. Okay, so we've moved to the tenor clef this time, but it's the same thing as before. Find your common note, your point of reference for each clef, and that was middle C here in the treble clef. Okay, first ledger line beneath the clef. And that middle C is located here on the tenor clef. Okay, the second line from the top. And let's just take the first note again. Remember that B has to go down an octave, so it's the B above C, above middle C, so it's going to be the B beneath middle C. And if it's directly beneath middle C in this clef, it's got to be directly beneath middle C in the tenor clef. That would be located here. And again, I've just written out all the notes just to let you see what it looks like when we move that melody into the tenor clef. So again, it needs to follow the same outline of the melody. So if it moves down a step in the treble clef, it's got to move down a step in the tenor, up to C, down to B, down to B, down to A, bit of a leap to F, up to G, big leap up to E, big leap up to E, down to D, down to D. Okay? So again, that's probably the fastest way of transposing, rather than doing each note individually and then referencing that with your middle C. Just do that for the first note and then work out the movement of your melody. Okay, so if it moves down a step from the first note to the second note, then it's got to move down a step in the other clef from the first note to the second note, and just continue that on until you get to the end of the music. So now that we've seen what transposing down an octave looks like, let's try transposing up an octave from one clef to another. Okay, so from the next couple of exercises we'll try transposition up an octave. So here is another melody. I've just changed the key signature, but we're going to take the top melody that's in the bass clef, and we're going to transpose it up an octave into the treble clef. So we start again by doing the same thing as before, finding a common note, a point of reference. Okay, so again, that's going to be middle C that I always use. So as we know from before, middle C is located the first ledger line above the bass clef, and it's located on the first ledger line beneath the treble clef. Okay, so that's the first thing that we do. Again, we can see from the very first note, which is a G, it's a G which is beneath middle C, so we want to transpose it up an octave, so it's going to become the G above middle C. Okay, so, and the G above middle C in the treble clef is located here. Okay, so that's the first note. So this time these two notes are still an octave apart, but the one on the treble clef is an octave higher than the one on the bass clef. So the one on the second staff is an octave higher than the one on the first staff. We can continue as before. We can look to see what is the outline of the melody in the bass clef and just copy that into the treble clef. So in the first melody we can see that we have a leap down from a G to a C. So we need to do that again in the treble clef. G down to C. Then we've got a movement up from C to D. So again up, up from C to D. In fact, we have two Ds, so we just copy that note. So again, you can see even when you come across notes that you've already transposed, just look back over the music to see do any notes repeat themselves, and then you can just save yourself the time and bother of having to transpose them again. You just copy them out. So here we can see that there are two Ds, so again you're going to have two Ds. Very easy. Again, we're moving up from D up to E, so in the treble clef we need to move from D up to E. Then we're moving down from E down to a B, so that B is going to be located here. And then from a B up to an F, bit of a leap there, up to F, and then F up to A down to G, and they're both quavers, and then from a G back down to your C. So it's again, it's very like the opening leap. Okay, and just to double check that to make sure, first note is from a G to a C, so it's moving down, yeah, G down to C, C up to D, yeah, and then D stays where it is, D to D, D to D, and then D up to E, D up to E, E down to B, E down to B, B up to F, B up to F, F up to A, F up to A down to G, A down to G, and then G down to C again, G down to C. And you can also look over, as I said, look over to see any notes that repeat themselves. So this note is the same as this note, so then that note has got to be the same as that note. Okay, so you can always look back over just to make sure that you've not made any mistakes. And again, this note is the same as this note, so that note has got to be the same as the first note as well. Okay, so that's down and that's up an octave from the bass to the treble. Let's try up an octave from the bass to the alto clef. So here we have the alto clef, and as you can see, our point of reference for the bass clef stays the same, but this time our middle C is located in here. Okay, same as before, where the two lines meet, the two lines join together on that line, that middle line. So let's do the exact same thing as before, but remember we're going up an octave this time. Okay, so we're transposing the melody that's in the bass but up an octave. So just to do the first note again, we can see that the first note G is the G beneath middle C. So we need the G above middle C this time, and that would be located here. Okay, so that is now your G above middle C. So we've transposed that first note up an octave, and now we can do the same thing as before. Just use that first note as your starting point, as your guide for every subsequent leap. Okay, just follow the outline of the melody for the bass clef and just move that into the alto clef now. And again, I've just done the melody for you there just to show you what it should look like in the alto clef. And again, take each leap between each note and turn and see if that is the same for both clefs. Okay, so between the first note, which is a G, and the second note, which is a C, see that jump? It's got to be exactly the same in the alto clef. Okay, so again we have a G going down to a C, C going up to a D, C and going up to a D, D stays where it is, D stays where it is, D moving up to E, D moving up to E, E falling down to B, E falling down to B. Bit of a leap up now to F, bit of a leap up to F, and then a leap from F to A, leap from F to A, moving down by a note, moving down by a note, and then a big leap again back down to your C, back down to your C. Same thing as before, you can check to see any notes that repeat have got to be the same. Okay, so for example, this C is the same as this C, so this C has got to be the same line as that C. Okay, and again, same as before, the G there has got to be the same there as it was before, with the G there and the G there. Okay, so again, you can just check to make sure that any notes that repeat themselves are on the same line or same space. Okay, so this time we're going to transpose the melody in the bass up an octave into the tenor clef. Okay, so we're going into the tenor clef this time, but again, like the alto clef, it's very easy to see where middle C is. It's just where the two lines meet, and that's on this line. So that's our point of reference now. Okay, so same thing as before. Let's try the first note. As we've already seen from the previous exercise, that G is the G beneath middle C. So we're looking to transpose it up an octave, so it's going to be the G above middle C in the tenor clef. Okay, and that is going to be located up here somewhere, so you're going to need a ledger line for this one. That is your first note. Okay, so that is your G. And again, I've just done the melody already for you, just to let you see what the melody from the bass clef looks like in the tenor clef transposed up an octave. Okay, so it should follow the same outline again, so let's have a look and see. Okay, G down to C, so again G down to C, C up to D, C up to D, D stays where it is, D stays where it is, D up to E, D up to E, E down to B, E down to B. Bit of a leap now from B to F, B to F, a bit of a leap up from F to A, F to A down to G, A down to G, and then finally G ending on your C, G ending on your C. And again, you can double check just to go over to make sure that any notes that are repeated are exactly the same, in the same line or space. So if we look here, we can see that your last note, that's C, is repeated there. So again, those two notes need to be the same here, and indeed they are. Yes, and your G from before is the same as your first note, so this note needs to be the same as your first note. So that's how we transpose up and down an octave between the four main clefs that we use in music, between the treble clef, the bass clef, the alto clef, and the tenor clef. Again, if you have any trouble with the material that we've looked at so far in this lesson, feel free to contact me anytime. Just go to the contact me page on the website, and if you have any queries or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you. And also, I hope that's given you a bit more insight into how transposition works, because in the next lesson we're going to be looking at transposition, but not up or down an octave. Okay, so far all the exercises we've looked at, we've been transposing up or down a perfect octave. In the next lesson we're going to be transposing up or down a major second, or up or down a minor third, or up or down a perfect fifth. Okay, so the next lesson is transposition, but we're going to be looking at transposing instruments. Instruments like the B flat clarinet, the trumpet in A, the horn in F. Okay, so it's going to get a little bit more difficult, and you will need to know about intervals to do that lesson. So I hope this has been of some help to you.